In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
In my experience, human beings tend to ignore mission statements and focus really a great deal on where is my spot in the hierarchy and how in the immediate circle around me of 5 or 10 people do I gain more trust, authority, and connection with that group of people. So it may be that Starbucks has a mission of caffeinating and connecting people who woke up this morning uncaffeinated and disconnected. But that's not what drives the barista who goes to Starbucks to work today. She is driven by, how does it feel to be in this particular Starbucks today? Or if I think about my friends at Acumen, which is one of the most important nonprofits, most of the people at Acumen do not spend most of their day making decisions solely based on their manifesto, which is one of the most beautiful mission statements I've read. They're making decisions based on that immediate circle around them and how will interacting with them make them feel like people like us. So that's why culture is important, because culture is this persistent, low-grade current that is running through everything we do. And it's local, it's not just global.
I'm Aga Bajer, and this is the CultureLab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabajer.com/podcast. Hi and welcome. Today is a really special day. We're celebrating. It's the 50th episode of the CultureLab podcast, and we have a guest I've been waiting to interview for almost 2 years. Yes, that's right, people. This is the episode when I finally get to interview Seth Godin. And if you don't know who Seth Godin is, go to our show notes to learn more. But also, I have to ask you, where have you been for the past 30 years? Anyway, Seth has been a huge influence for me. I've read all of his books, participated in a few of his seminars, and he's even inspired me to leave my cushy corporate job and to strike out on my own. In the early days of the CultureLab, I approached Seth and I invited him to come on the show. And he told me, sure, I'd love to. I'll be your 50th guest. Now, I'm no math genius, but I calculated that it would take me approximately a year and a half if I continued releasing just 2 episodes per month. But I also knew that no matter what, I wouldn't give up producing this podcast. Not until the 50th episode anyway. Now, this is exactly what Seth does. He finds ingenious ways to help us keep going, do the work that matters, persist in the face of adversity and in the face of our own resistance, to hone our craft and show up with integrity every single day. He's also an incredible source of practical wisdom and knowledge about how to shape the cultures around us, how to shape them in a way that will enable us to make a dent in the world and to bend history in the right direction. I really can't tell you how privileged I feel to have had the opportunity to pick his brain and to learn from him. And I know that if you care about the place where you are and the impact that you want to make, you will love this interview. Enjoy. Seth, welcome to CultureLab. I'm thrilled to have you as a guest.
Well, it's good to be talking with you.
As you know, this podcast is about culture. And the first question I ask all of our guests is this: What were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? In other words, what made Seth Seth?
Oh, I think those are probably two different questions. But if we look at, evolutionary biology and the psychology of how we grow up and what imprints on us, I grew up in a great household with two extraordinary parents. We lived in a little teeny house just outside of New York City. And I guess my memories are certainly fuzzy, but the biggest cultural influence was to be a free range kid, to be outside, to expose oneself to exploring the basement of an unfinished house or riding a bicycle through a strange neighborhood, coming to the conclusion that the world wasn't particularly dangerous. And I guess that's where I would start in a cultural narrative.
I love that. And I can totally see how that can have an impact on you, because actually I was one of those free range kids as well. And I think for my country, I'm probably the last generation. And so, yes, growing up with the sense the world is not a dangerous place, it definitely influences how we show up in life and what we do. So, Seth, you've been writing and talking about culture for a really long time, and it's been mostly in the context of marketing and changing a culture as a way of serving an audience, often potential clients or customers. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on using those same principles of culture change internally in the context of organizational culture?
Well, it's still marketing. I mean, I've redefined marketing to mean what you are describing. And when you have an organization of any kind, meaning that there's more than three people, you have a culture, whether you want to have one or not. And if that culture is going to be useful, it's probably because you worked hard at choosing it. You didn't just accidentally back into it. And those choices are big and small. They are the things you do when the chips are down and it's difficult. They're the things you do when you think no one is looking. They're the things you do when the short-term pressure is to do the opposite. When we make those choices, if we make the easy choice at every turn, we're going to end up with a culture just like every place else because everyone else is making the easy choices. So the opportunity we have is to decide up front, what are we going to do when we have to make a hard choice so that we don't have to, in the moment, find reserves that might not be handy.
Which makes me think of the experience that I've had in the marketing seminar. I participated in the marketing seminar twice and I loved it. And it's not just because of the content, which was amazing, and the incredible learning, but also because of this very distinct culture that emerged both times, actually. And so I imagine that probably, and I was very curious as a culture geek, as you can imagine. I was curious, how intentional were you and your team in cultivating the right culture and making these tough choices?
Well, I'm thrilled that you were part of it, and I'm glad that you noticed this. It is the most important thing that we do. I've run these Udemy courses. More people have taken them than just about any other in the category. But there is zero culture in a Udemy course. There's just videos. So to move over to a platform that we have to build from scratch, that isn't going to be as popular as a Udemy course, that's going to be less lucrative, there better be a good reason. And so at every turn, we have made choices about the kinds of interactions, about who we will amplify and who we will ask to calm down or step aside. These choices lead to a culture. And I believe in learning way more than education. And we are trying to model a learning culture where it is expected that people will reach a little bit beyond their grasp and where they will be extremely generous in paying things forward to the community so that the community can grow.
And it's really incredible how effective this has been, because 2.5, almost 3 years down the line, the three of us who formed a mastermind group, we are still meeting every single week and supporting each other on our journey. So I think it's just a testament to how powerful that work that you had done at the beginning, laying the groundwork for the culture, has really been for us as participants.
Well, thank you. And it's also fair to say that not everyone has that same result. So you have to take a lot of the credit because we get what we bring, and you have found others who brought the same sort of thing. And so mostly what we're trying to do is help people find the others. If you can find the others, then you can run with it. And I think that that's worth doing.
I love that. So let's talk about finding the others. I really love your definition of culture, which is people like us do things like this. And I think anyone reflecting on this definition will quickly realize that culture change is so difficult because it often involves a change in really core and deeply rooted stuff, like people's identity and their habitual patterns of behavior. And, it's a tricky territory, right? So how do we help people reconsider their identity and interrupt habitual patterns of behavior? Because I think, and I can imagine, even in the marketing seminar, I'm sure that there were people who maybe were not really used to behaving in such a generous way, but being exposed to that culture, I'm sure for some of us, we found it attractive, and we were encouraged to do something for others. And eventually, I'm hoping that also this spilled over into people's lives outside of the seminar as well. So it was a microcosm of what can happen, I suppose, in any culture. So back to my question, how do we help people reconsider what their identity is and how we can help them interrupt some of the habitual patterns of behaviors?
I think the trap that a lot of people fall into when they try to change the culture is they simply announce what things like this are, and they skip the people like us part. And what we have to do is we have to have the guts to say to people, if you want to be people like us, you need to do things like this. And if you don't want to, you need to leave. And if you're not prepared to have the you need to leave part, it's going to be very difficult to help people find the resolve to get through the tension to change, because people don't like to change. One thing that will motivate people to change is our huge desire to be people like us. And so we are prepared to say to people, oh, it's not for you. If you're not prepared to say that, then good luck changing the culture. But if you're prepared to say, here's the phone number of our competitor. Oh, you don't like spicy food. Well, there's a restaurant a block away that only sells Polish food. Here's their phone number. I'll walk you over there. Then you can create the culture that you want. But if someone says, I don't like spicy food, and then you start bending over backwards to be inclusive to everyone, well, then you don't have people like us anymore. And therefore, you don't get to define what things like this are.
Which kind of makes me think about how does that fit into this really important conversation about diversity today?
Well, first, I love this question. Let's be really clear what I mean when I say people like us. I do not mean people of the same height or hairstyle or color or sexual orientation or political point of view, irrelevant to almost all of these conversations. What I mean is, are you enrolled in the journey? And if you're not enrolled in the journey, then I don't care where you came from and I don't care what you look like. You need to leave, because we're going on a journey. This bus is going to Cleveland. And if you don't want to go to Cleveland, whining the whole trip is not helping anybody. And so culture thrives when we bring together people of different backgrounds with different points of view. But it requires people to be enrolled in the journey that the leader has set out. And if the leader doesn't have a journey in mind, well, then we shouldn't be surprised that we're not going anywhere.
Absolutely, which I think in the organizational context is probably around what's our mission, what do we stand for, and what's our purpose? Why are we here? Who are we serving? Which kind of leads me to a hypothetical scenario that I've prepared for you. I know that it would be probably really hard to convince you to take on a startup today. I know that you really enjoy what you're doing right now, but let's imagine this hypothetical situation that there is a startup and it has a really meaningful mission and you join it. I'm curious, how would you decide to invest your energy, your time, your resources in creating the right kind of culture? What would you start with? And then what would you do next?
Well, I think if we're going to go for a hypothetical, you need to be on the hook for more specifics. But the hard part is, what do you do when you're doing the hard part? So I like to tell the story of ivermectin. Now, Milton Friedman wrote an article that was ill-founded, incorrect, and dangerous about 50 years ago. In it, he said that the only purpose of a corporation is to maximize shareholder profit. And he just made that up. There's no basis in fact of that, but it spread like wildfire among fearful CEOs who like nothing better than a simple algorithm that lets them decide what to do next. So a researcher in Japan discovers a microorganism in the dirt, publishes a paper. A guy named William Campbell in New Jersey reads the paper and realizes that with some work, he might be able to create a drug out of this. And after a couple of years at Merck, he comes up with ivermectin. And ivermectin is a medicine that can cure river blindness. And river blindness is one of the most horrible diseases in human history. It afflicts millions of people. You get bit by a small fly, and then you go blind for the rest of your life. It has caused huge swaths of land in Central Africa to become completely abandoned because it's just not worth the risk to live there. Well, he brings the drug to the management of Merck. And here's the question. Is Milton Friedman right? Because if you're going to launch a drug that cures river blindness, you are trying to help people who have no money. That doesn't maximize shareholder value in the short run. Well, to their credit, the leadership of Merck said, we will bring this drug to market for as long as it takes and for as much as it costs, because our mission is not to maximize shareholder profit. Our mission is people like us, researchers, doctors, healthcare professionals, do things like this, which is save millions of people from going blind. And to this day, a dose of ivermectin costs 12 cents. And as a result, there are millions of people who are not blind. Millions. That's a cultural choice. That's a choice that Merck made a very long time ago, because what they have established for the doctors and the researchers and the scientists is this is a good place to work, because we're not just going to sit here trying to create opioid addicts. We are going to be a place that actually works to heal. And that's part of their mission, but it's easy to have a mission statement. What's hard to do is when ivermectin shows up to make a decision about what to do with it. So back to your original point, I think that now that we've got software that is so highly leveraged and ideas that are so easy to spread, what I want to know if I'm going to start another startup is, what change are we seeking to make in the world, right? Are we trying to change our bank account from X to X times 10? Or are we trying to change the way human beings are in the world? And I'm way more interested in the second one.
And this is a wonderful foundation then to build on that tribe of people like us. Because when you are referring to that, I imagine it's about people who believe in that mission and who are willing to make difficult choices that serve the mission, even if it costs them money, right?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit here, because in my experience, that's not really the case. In my experience, human beings tend to ignore mission statements and focus really a great deal on where is my spot in the hierarchy and how in the immediate circle around me of 5 or 10 people do I gain more trust, authority, and connection with that group of people. So it may be that Starbucks has a mission of caffeinating and connecting people who woke up this morning uncaffeinated and disconnected. But that's not what drives the barista who goes to Starbucks to work today. She is driven by, how does it feel to be in this particular Starbucks today? Or if I think about my friends at Acumen, which is one of the most important nonprofits, most of the people at Acumen do not spend most of their day making decisions solely based on their manifesto, which is one of the most beautiful mission statements I've read. They're making decisions based on that immediate circle around them and how will interacting with them make them feel like people like us. So that's why culture is important, because culture is this persistent, low-grade current that is running through everything we do. And it's local. It's not just global.
I love that. And I think it's such an important point to make. And it's really helpful for me as well, because actually, yes, we have to be pragmatic and we have to think about what experience people have in every single small part of the organization, which kind of makes me think about this quote that I have in my electronic signature. And everyone who gets an email from me also gets to read this. We can't change the culture, but each of us has the opportunity to change a culture, our little pocket of the world. And of course, this quote is from you. And I think what you've just said speaks to that. Why not the culture? Why a culture? Because then it really becomes feasible for anyone to be cultivating or shaping that environment around them, right?
Exactly. And it doesn't let us off the hook, right? A mission statement that was crafted by a big committee lets everyone else off the hook. Because, if you work 25 levels down at the Red Cross, their giant mission statement has very little to do with what you're going to navigate between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock this afternoon.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, so let's go to my second hypothetical scenario, and I'm going to be more specific this time. So imagine that you agreed to take the role of a CEO in an organization. And it has an important mission. It has a potential. It knows what change it wants to create in the world, and they want to make the right dent in the world. You can identify with that. But it also experiences a lot of cultural issues. And soon after you join, you realize that there is unhealthy competition, politics, maybe people feel paralyzed by perfectionism and fear of failure and fear of appearing incompetent. And those in the position of power talk about empowerment, but are not really willing to relinquish their own power. Others just want to play it safe. So what would you do to take things forward and cultivate a culture that would help this company do the work that matters for the people who care?
Well, you've just described every organization at some level.
Yeah.
And the first question is, who gets the Employee of the Month parking space? Meaning, and I don't know where you live, but they have Employee of the Month parking spaces here, which is that if you are the most compliant, obedient, hardest working employee at the International House of Pancakes, you get a special parking space or your name on a plaque for the month, because that's the way the industrialist rewards the compliant worker. And if you start giving the Employee of the Month award to somebody who has broken rules for the right reason, failed for the right reason, helped others for the right reason, you start sending a message about what are things like around here. If you start rewarding people because they're good at politics, you're going to get more politics. The flip side of that is, who gets in trouble around here? Because if someone came to your office, stole 6 laptops, and left, you would call the cops. But if somebody shows up in your office and wrecks a brainstorming meeting by being negative, you just sort of roll with it. And I think that's a mistake because wrecking a brainstorming meeting costs more than 6 laptops. And so it's entirely appropriate to sit down with somebody and say, maybe you didn't understand how things are around here. I saw the following behavior. If you do that behavior again, even if it's justified, I will fire you in front of everybody. And I think that's a totally legitimate way to manage and lead. And I have done it, and it has worked. Because if you're not serious enough to do that, but you're serious enough to fire someone for embezzlement, why did you decide that embezzlement is so much worse than willfully sabotaging the culture of what you're trying to build?
So would you say, Seth, that in a way, the most important person or the person who has the most leverage is the leader in the organization as far as culture is concerned? Because definitely
I don't think that's true at all. I think that what's true is everyone is creating the culture, but not everyone gets to be a manager with authority. And managers with authority are different than leaders. Leaders need enrollment. Leaders need people who want to be there and want to go where you are going. Managers need compliance. And managers in the Western culture have a tool. And the tool is they can order compliance. And if the organization you described to me sounded so broken, and I don't have a lot of time to fix it, I'm showing up and saying, I'm not going to wear my leadership hat today. I'm wearing my manager hat today because you don't seem to be enrolled in where we are going. But let me just describe to you one more time where we are going, because if you are enrolled, then this behavior will never show up again. But if you're not, and you've heard me state clearly where we're going, then yeah, we both agree you should leave.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a time and a place to play that role. And as you say, what you are not tolerating is as important as what you are rewarding, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I had one of my single most valuable employees was a yeller. And he would yell at meetings at people. And the second time he did it, I took him aside and I said, I don't want to work in a company with a yeller. And I'm willing to take a significant hit, but I'll fire you. It's okay, because I don't want to come to work with a yeller. So you heard me. Do we have any questions about this? The next time you yell, I don't care what the reason is, I'm going to fire you in front of everyone. And not only did he never yell again in the office, he thanked me about 6 months later. The guy was in his 50s. He had had a long, successful career, and no one had ever spoken up to him. And he said, I like myself better now. Thank you.
Wow. And it's really interesting, isn't it? How to hold these conversations with people and give them that opportunity to enroll. Because I suppose, in every company, you have these people who are valuable contributors, but at the same time, some of their behaviors is not entirely aligned with the culture that you want to cultivate. And I suppose that one of the challenges in changing the way people behave is that often they have a slightly different worldview and different beliefs, and look at life through a completely different lens. So I'm curious, what would you say, Seth, is the right posture, mindset, and skills to have these conversations and to help people understand what you're trying to create, and also help them embrace and enroll into what you're trying to create?
Well, that's a great point. Here's the deal. Everyone does the right thing every time. Everyone does, based on who they are, what they want, what they believe, and where they're going. They do exactly what they think they should do. Their behavior is intentional. If you want to change someone's behavior, therefore, you have to start by changing who they are, what they want, what they believe, and where they're going. Because they're always going to do the thing that they think is right. And culture in an organization where there are managers and leaders is tricky indeed, because everyone has a different noise in their head. Everyone believes something you don't believe. Everyone wants something you don't want. Now, you can try to paper this over by paying people. You can try to paper it over by manipulation. But I think it's way better to dig deep into, well, what do you want? And what do you see? And what do you believe? Because if we can get in sync about that, I don't have to manage your behavior at all, because your behavior will be in sync with where we are going.
So is it about creating a common understanding and a common ground in terms of how we view reality and what works here and what doesn't work here?
Yeah, let's remember that you're spending more time at work than you are with your family, and that if work falls apart, you're going to starve to death because you're not going to get paid. So it's fraught with a lot of emotional overhead, and everyone is carrying around fear. And the fear is not just the fear of we're going to go bankrupt. It's the fear of I will be found out as a fraud. It's the fear of I don't know what to do next. It's the fear of insufficiency. And so it's not surprising to me at all that people bring all of that to work. And we got to figure out which part of that we are willing to dance with and embrace with, and which part of it we can't. But there's a huge responsibility when you hire people, when you work with people, when you build a culture. But what I refuse to do is let people off the hook and say, because it's hard, you shouldn't bother. Because then you end up with the generic default culture, and we all know that that's lousy.
Yeah, we do indeed. So I want us to a little bit to stay with this notion of the stuff, the luggage that people carry, and the stuff that we all bring into the workplace, and how it causes us to show up. And I think very often one of the big frustrations that a lot of people share with me, and I'm sure with you as well, is that their colleagues will say, well, yeah, we've tried this hasn't worked here, or this will never work here, or some other form of resistance, or at least this is interpreted as resistance. And it's linked to a question from one of our listeners, and also one of the members actually of my mastermind group, Angela Beeching.
Hi, Seth. I'm so happy to be able to ask this question. And thank you so much for the freelancers workshop and the marketing seminar. I gained so much from that. So I'm a coach, and I'm interested in getting past resistance, not just my own, but helping my clients do that as well. So here's what I'm wondering. Have you found any indicators that show whether or not someone is willing or ready to take action? And any tools or exercises that are especially good for helping people take action in the face of resistance? Thank you.
Okay, well, so let's take a minute to define Pressfield's term of resistance, which is the voice of the lizard brain that shows up when we are feeling fearful, inadequate, and afraid. And it is a wily beast indeed, in that it pushes us to come up with excuses. It is responsible for writer's block. It's responsible for overeating, undereating, insomnia. We will do almost anything to avoid being put on the spot. And there isn't a hack to make it go away. And the reason is because it never goes away. As long as we think something is important, we are going to have to engage with resistance. And that is the point. And that's why the work where resistance shows up is so valuable, because everyone else is afraid to do it. So where I begin is by helping people see that it's a privilege to feel resistance, and that dancing with the resistance, engaging with the resistance is the work. That the stuff we do when we don't feel like doing it, that's the hard part. So if you don't feel like doing it, it's a symptom. So that's the first thing I would say. But the second thing is that to become a professional at some level is to do something enough times that you no longer feel resistance about doing it again. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if I said to you, write a blog post tomorrow that will be read by 1 million people, I'm guessing you would feel some anxiety, some fear, some resistance. But I do that every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't feel it at all because I've been doing it for 20 years. That a surgeon, if someone asked me to cut somebody open and save their life by removing an organ, I would freak out. But there are surgeons who do that 3 times a day, right? She shows up, she does her work. Because after you've done 30 surgeries or 70 surgeries, it doesn't seem like a matter of life and death so much. So part of
Mm-hmm.
this is building a culture, whether it's for yourself or your team, where this is what we do. We chop wood, we carry water, we do things that other people think are risky, and we do them with generosity.
Yeah. That's wonderful. And actually, it makes me think of a pact that we took with Angela and Silky. We decided to do the scary thing every single day for 21 days. and if we skip a day, then we lost the streak and we have to go back to base one. And I'm already finding that it really changes the way we think about ourselves, which I think is such a wonderful thing. So when you go where resistance is and you are willing to be, to stay with the discomfort, basically, or choose courage over comfort, it kind of shapes also your identity. And this is the first step to changing a culture as well, I suppose, because of course it has a ripple effect, and it has an impact on the people around us. So thank you so much for that, Seth. I have another question from a listener. This question is from Martin Ulrich.
Well, thank you for allowing me to ask a question, and I'll get right to it. In order to establish a strong culture, I think having a common language is essential. And do you think that if anyone does not completely understand the language, could be the reason for a lack of engagement or sustainability and even acceptance of the change?
Oh, yeah, I think Martin is right on. And when I'm thinking language, I'm not thinking someone speaking French versus Dutch.
Sure.
I'm thinking about the shorthands, the code words, the hand signals. You know, if you watch the traders at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, they're not even speaking except when they're yelling at each other. They're using hand signals. And that's a common language. So one of the things that I've always done since I was 17 as a builder of culture is invent words, invent phrases, invent ways to establish that you are people like us, because they are priceless.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of a word that you've invented to shape culture?
Well, I mean, certainly in my books, things like idea virus and purple cow and tribes, these are words that I used in ways that other people didn't use them and got a lot of flack for it. But it's my job. My job is to change the culture among my readers, and the easiest way to do it is to come up with a word that actually means 100 words. But if you know the word, I don't have to say the 100 words over and over again.
Yeah, totally.
Right? And, you know, in my first job as a teacher, and this was my 42nd summer up in Canada doing it, when you teach a kid how to paddle a 17-foot canoe by themselves, a lot of it is, here are 10 words you've never heard or seen before. Let's learn these words, because if we know these words, then we can start down this path of being that kind of person.
Wow, I love that. Giving people the language, absolutely. I love that. It's also interesting to see how some of the companies that are really good at shaping culture, how they're using language. Like recently, I've interviewed Gary Ridge from WD-40, and he told me they banned and that they don't use the word manager anymore. They only have coaches. And someone would argue, well, probably they do quite similar things, but I really think that by using this word coach only and never referring to people who have people responsibility, never referring to them as managers, I really do think that it has an impact on how people see themselves and also how people see their managers.
If you follow through, otherwise it's Orwellian.
Totally, yeah. And it breeds cynicism, absolutely. So next question is from Steve.
As an agile coach, I keep finding executives and C-level that can talk the talk of agility, but they cannot walk the walk. What recommendations do you have to engage executives, C-level stakeholders, so that they are not fueling that chasm, fueling that dichotomy? How could I get them fully engaged? Thank you.
Okay, well, let me first address the substantive, smaller part of the question, which is agile coaching is misnamed. It should be called failure coaching because that's what agile is. Agile is about lowering the water to see the rocks in the stream, but it also means that you have way more short-term failure on your way to better long-term success. And hiding that doesn't help you move forward. That the reason that organizations are structured the way they are before they embrace Agile is because it feels safer. It feels safer to have more meetings, more layers, more tests that are insulating you from the reality of the market or of physics. Inside the, I think it's not the Alt MBA, inside the marketing seminar, one of the questions I like to talk about is not the hackneyed, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? Because the answer to that is you should be Superman. But instead the question is, what would you do if you knew you would fail? If you knew it wasn't going to work, what would you do where you could actually learn something? Well, that's a version of Agile. And so when people show up and say, I'm pushing back on you, what they're not pushing back on is the efficacy of your approach. What they're pushing back on is the feeling that they will have today and tomorrow and the next day of dancing with failure, which leads to the bigger question, which is, what does enrollment look like? Enrollment is almost always about long-term versus short-term. It's not hard at all to get enrollment in the short term because you want chocolate, here's chocolate. Okay, we're done. Enrollment in the long term is give up 3 things you want so you can get something you want even more tomorrow. We need enrollment to get there. And so if you got a client who is pushing back, it may be because he or she hasn't been sold hard enough on what are you giving up to get what you want in the long run.
Yeah. Yeah. And having a conversation around that, I suppose, first, what is it that you want in the long run and what would be the best way to get there? And I think very often when people start reflecting on it, they do realize that they will not get there by doing the same stuff they've been doing for the past 20 years.
Bingo.
Yeah. That's wonderful. And I think that, there's one question I just want our listeners to hear that from you. I probably suspect what you will say, but what would you have to say to those of our listeners who say, okay, fine, I am going to focus on culture. I get it. It's important, but I need results fast.
And what do you think I'm going to say?
Well, I think in the context of what you've just mentioned about enrollment and also knowing your work a little bit and knowing that you talk about focusing on a culture, I suppose that's probably you would say a version of pick a pocket of your culture that is going to have the biggest positive impact on the change that you want to make in the world and try to understand what worldviews people have and how they will need to change in order to create that change in your culture. And then focus all your energy, all your resources, all everything that you have to really pull that lever and make that change. So don't try to do it all and don't expect that it's going to be an overnight change, but it's a big assumption. So over to you.
I love that answer. I really do. I was going in a slightly different direction, which is if you don't have time to do it right, where are you going to find the time to do it over? And most of the people who say that they're in a hurry are actually saying they are afraid. And being in a hurry lets you off the hook for being afraid because you don't have to live with the feeling of this might not work, because you find out right away that it does. But the reason you're talking to us is because what's currently working for you in a hurry is not working for you. That's why you want to change it. If what you're doing now is working for you, class is over. Thanks for coming.
Mm.
But if it's not working for you, maybe you're in this cycle because you keep trying to do something that's going to work in the short run. And I completely concur with you that the transition is all about racking up wins as you go. But there are no wins that are as fast as what you're doing now. They just work better, but they're not faster.
Wow. But it just hit me so hard in a positive way, what you've just said about when people say that they are in a hurry, they are actually in a place of fear. I think it's so true. Yeah, that's incredible. Okay, so shall we move on to the rapid fire questions?
Okay, let's go.
I have 5 questions, and the idea is that you'll try to answer them in under 2 minutes. And the first one, I think we've answered partially, but I'm curious if you will have something slightly different for us. How do you define organizational culture?
Well, I think it's the thing that arises when human beings interact with each other.
And what would be the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
Well, is it helping you get what you want? Because if it isn't, then you probably need to change it.
Do you admire any companies for their culture? And if yes, why?
Well, as soon as I answer that question, the company completely falls apart. So I try not to pick any specific. But there are definitely, when I used to go to the Fast Company offices in the year 1996 or 8, I just became a better human within minutes of walking in. I feel the same way at many of the nonprofits that I visit with. Sometimes you just walk into a place and you can tell that care has been put into how humans are interacting with one another for the long haul. And it doesn't last forever. Sometimes it lasts for a decade. Sometimes it lasts for a year or even a month. But it's worth seeking out.
As we were preparing for this interview, you told me that you don't have a book to recommend, because one of the questions was, would you recommend a book on culture and on leadership? So my question now is, why don't you have a book to recommend?
Well, I wrote Linchpin because it was my answer to this question. However, most of the time when people read a specific nonfiction book, they are looking either for instructions or reassurance. And this is about emotional shift. So I bet there's a book of poetry that would have the effect that we are seeking, but it's going to be different for different people. What I'm asking people to do is decide that they care enough about the place where they are and the impact they want to make, that they are willing to do a significant number of uncomfortable things to get there. But if you're going to look for step-by-step instructions, I fear you will not find them.
And so what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own CultureLab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Well, my glib answer is stop looking for one thing. But my better, more generous answer is start to imagine the most positive, effective culture you've experienced in a given situation. And now, when you are in the situation that you're in, imagine how it would be different if it was in that culture instead of the culture you're currently working in. That if we can start benchmarking the best versions of how culture caused us to change, then we can say, oh, I could apply that here. So when you're at the airport and the gate agent is yelling at all the customers, okay, well, this is a culture problem. It's not a logistics problem. It's not a technology problem. It's a culture problem. Have you ever been in a situation where there has been just as much stress and this hasn't happened? Okay, how could you bring that to this spot? Or,
Yeah.
when we see something that does work, like ivermectin at Merck, we say, well, what happened at Merck in their culture that permitted this to happen that is not happening at Purdue Pharmaceuticals, right? Well, how do we move that culture over here? And I think this idea that culture is transportable and that it can be modeled is a breakthrough. And the fact that you're doing this podcast is evidence that the idea is spreading and that it's important.
It's very true. So, one last question that I have is, what is the question that I haven't asked you and I probably should have?
Well, we've built the Alt MBA to go deep into all of this work, and I have been blown away by the span and depth of what we've talked about over the last 45 minutes or so. I guess the place that people will let themselves off the hook is by realizing they are not the CEO. And so this is someone else's problem. And so I guess the question I might pose to myself is this someone else's problem? And the answer is no, because all culture is local, and that most culture changes not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And so wherever you are in the ladder, you have as much leverage to change the culture as most people. And you can begin right now.
I love that. I don't know if you have any other final thoughts that you'd like to leave our listeners with. This is a beautiful one, definitely, to leave people with. Is there anything else that you'd like to close with?
Well, the people who are listening to this are people like us. So now our job is to show up and do that work that matters.
Yes. Amen. Let's go and do it. Thank you so much, Seth. It was a huge pleasure to speak to you. And I'm going to post the links to the places where people can find you. It's not difficult to find you, but I'm wondering if you would like to point our listeners to any specific places or let them know about any specific stuff that you are doing at the moment that could help them to cultivate the right cultures.
Well, thanks. And thank you for this great interview. If people go to akimbo.com, AKIMBO, they will find all our workshops. And if they go to akimbo.link, they'll find my podcast. And if they type Seth into their favorite search engine, they'll find my daily blog. So that's enough.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Keep making this ruckus.
I'm Aga Bajer, the creator and host of the CultureLab podcast. And this is the CultureLab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, Content Editor.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the CultureLab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The CultureLab Insider, go to www.agabayer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabajer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. Okay, so now it's the time for a short preview of the next episode. And I'm super excited to let you know that I will be bringing you an interview with the New York Times bestselling author, Cy Wakerman. Cy is one of the most provocative and badass women that I know. She doesn't try to placate us, she doesn't try to be nice, and she's sure to make you feel uncomfortable. She does that by pointing out the mess that our businesses are in and also pointing us to the major source of toxicity and misery in our cultures and in our lives. She talks about the unnecessary drama. And Cy is the person who has the most provocative response to my question about how they define organizational culture. She said, culture is the excuse people give for not reaching their goals and not acting in integrity. Wow. This really made me stop and think, could this be true? It also got me curious about what's the relationship between culture personal accountability, and integrity. In this little snippet, Sai is speaking about why we shouldn't trust our thoughts so much. Listen in.
Most of what you think isn't a reflection of what's actually happened. And in fact, most people don't understand that they aren't really the thinker. Like, they're the person observing the thinker. There's just always this tape of color commentary playing in your head. And it's not you in that moment generating the thinking. And if you don't believe this, like when you get up tomorrow morning, notice, do you wake up and then say, I shall commence thinking now? Or just notice when you wake up if you're already being thought. And what happens is the ego part of us, our low self-love, certainty over accuracy. So if somebody walks by me and doesn't say hello, I have zero certainty of what that was about. Zero. All I know for sure is they walked by me and potentially didn't say hello. I might have missed it. So I don't have any certainty about this, but the ego loves certainty. So the ego will very quickly go, oh, I know what this is about. Ever since she got that promotion, she thinks she's better than the rest of us, and she's acting rude.
Thank you for listening to this episode of CultureLab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.